Welcome to the Commissioner's Office, Episode 1, the inaugural episode. I've mentioned in chat a number of times since we kind of got everybody together for Madden 17 that I was going to be rolling out with a series of content podcasts, and they would be centered around scheme and team building and basically unloading just about everything I know for the league. A lot of it is going to be stuff that some people know, if not a lot of people, but hopefully there's some tidbits of information that can help teams out, especially if you're a team that maybe isn't contending for the playoffs or making the playoffs every single year. This first episode is probably going to be the most basic of them all. I have a handful planned out. The first few are going to focus on defense, and then we're going to talk about offense a little bit. Today we're going to talk about the front seven. I said this was going to be one of the more basic episodes of the series. A lot of what we cover today is going to be stuff that most people in the league know. Okay, we're going to get more in depth and more detail with probably some things that a lot of you might not know as much about in later episodes when we talk about coverage and team building, things like that. But today I want to talk about the front seven, and namely we're talking about the 3-4 versus the 4-3. Now, the very basic part of this, probably almost everyone, if not everyone in the league, knows, which is the basic formation of the 3-4 versus the 4-3. What's the difference? 3-4, you have 3 down linemen and 4 linebackers, and the 4-3, you have 4 down linemen and 3 linebackers. Now, I'm sure everyone probably understands that. If you don't, no shame in that. But I want to talk about some of the details in terms of what differentiates the two schemes, with the goal of helping teams that sort of just stumble into whatever scheme they start the cycle with and never know, should you be switching? Should you be changing schemes? What is the best fit for your personnel? And what player type should you really be going out and looking for? And how does that align with the coverage scheme you're going to be picking? So I want to try to go into some level of depth, and hopefully that there, while a lot of it's going to be basic, hopefully there are some tidbits that help out some of the less experienced users in the league. I know that when I first started playing online at the beginning of Madden 15, I knew the basics of football, but I have learned so much, and I continue to read all kinds of stuff. I became an X's and O's junkie, pretty much devour anything I can find online about scheme. So hopefully there's some stuff that you can get out of this. Now we're going to start with the 3-4. I said it was 3 down linemen and 4 linebackers. Just in terms of outlining the profiles of the player and what they should look like in terms of who you should be getting for your team if you don't already have one. You have the nose tackle, which is a defensive tackle, but it's a particular type of defensive tackle, plays in the middle on the line of scrimmage. Primary job is to stuff the run, and ideally the better nose tackles in the league are absorbing 2 blockers, 2 offensive linemen, which allows other players on the team to hopefully create some mismatches. Your defensive ends, you have 1 on each side. They tend to be much bigger than the defensive ends in a 4-3 because their responsibilities are a little bit different. First and foremost, they tend to be run stuffers. You're generally looking for guys in the 285 to 305 pounds range. Then you have your outside linebackers. In a 3-4, your outside linebackers, more than anything else, should primarily be edge pass rushers. They're going to be generally rushing from a 2-point stance, which means they're standing up or in a crouched position, as opposed to the 3-point stance, which means they're playing on the line of scrimmage with their hand in the dirt. And then you have 2 inside linebackers in the 3-4, and these also need to be a little bit bigger because they need to be big enough to take on offensive linemen. They don't have 4 defensive linemen in front of them absorbing blockers, so they need to be capable of shedding a block versus a much bigger offensive lineman. We'll kind of go over different player types and different wrinkles in the scheme here in a minute. One of the advantages of the 3-4 is it's effective at bringing pressure from multiple angles, whereas the 4-3 tends to be a little bit more vanilla and predictable. But the 3-4 can also be slightly more vulnerable to the run because you do have 1 fewer defensive lineman, and passes across the middle of the field at times can be more punishing to the 3-4 than the 4-3 because your linemen tend to be bigger, a little bit slower. They may not be as good in coverage. You don't have those freakish athletes a lot of the times that you might see at middle linebacker in the 4-3. There's some variations, when you go up to the NFL level, you can get to levels of complexity that scales far beyond what I know about, but some of the basic variations has to do with gap assignments. The 3-4 traditionally has been a 2-gap system, which means if you're a defensive lineman and you're playing on the line of scrimmage with your hand in the dirt, you tend to line up. Generally speaking, rule of thumb, and there's lots of NFL teams that don't do it this way, but generally speaking, you're lined up directly over your offensive lineman, and your job, your responsibility is to stop the run to either side of that offensive lineman. So that's why they call it the 2-gap system. So if you're the nose tackle and you're lining up directly over the center, you are responsible for helping stop the run to either side of the center. So those dive plays up the middle, you'd be responsible. Whereas a 1-gap system, like a 4-3, and also some variations of the 3-4. A 1-gap system is where you have, let's say you're lining up and over the center, you might line up a little bit to the left or to the right of the center, and your job when the ball is snapped is to literally, you can be a little bit more aggressive pushing up that gap. Primary responsibility is to stop the run, but then you are closer to the quarterback if it's a pass play. So you can be more aggressive. You're pushing up into the gap as opposed to sitting back a little bit more reactively and covering 2 gaps. The reason that's important, and listen, gap play is probably not represented all that well in Madden, but I'm covering this on a basic level because we've read that in Madden 17 they've at least given this a little bit of attention. So you want different player types. If you're running a 2-gap system where you want these giant, 295 to 300 pound run stuffers who are really strong, they need to cover the gap on either side. You don't necessarily need these guys to be premier pass rushers. We'll go over some details about that in a second. But if you are going to run a 1-gap system, you might want to consider leaning more toward guys that can rush the passer a little bit better, can get around blockers, because that's going to be what they're doing in a 1-gap system. The 3-4 can be used with pretty much any coverage shell. And by coverage shell, we'll cover that in a lot of detail in later episodes. But you have man coverage, cover 2, cover 3, cover 4, zone blitzing, Tampa 2. These are examples of coverage systems. And 3-4 aligns really well with man coverage due to the propensity that the 3-4 has to send extra blitzers. One of the advantages I said a while ago is that you can send pressure from multiple angles. Obviously you have your 2 outside linebackers. You're basically blitzing one of them at all times, and then often you can bring both of them. And with the right personnel, you can run some zone systems as well. Obviously, Dick LeBeau and the Pittsburgh Steelers really popularized a zone blitzing scheme. This works really, really well with a 3-4 front 7. It can be very, very effective where you have at any given play. It can be very confusing to the offense in terms of which guys are dropping back into short coverage, underneath coverage, and which guys are actually rushing the passer. So it's important to kind of think about what your front 7 should look like when you're figuring out what you're most comfortable with in coverage. Because while you can use any coverage with a 3-4, at the end of the day, it does align a little bit better with a couple of different things because of the player types that you're asking them to do. Like it's harder to run a Tampa 2 out of a 3-4. You don't really see that in the NFL. I'm not saying it couldn't be done in Madden, but you don't really see a strong zone cover 2 defense being run with a 3-4 because typically you're asking your linebackers to be able to drop back in coverage. You need them to be a little bit faster, better in zone coverage. And a prototypical 3-4 linebacker, whether it's inside or outside, is not going to be as strong in coverage. So let's cover in a little bit more detail what you should be looking for when building your team. Throughout this series, one of my goals I mentioned was I want to help people throughout the cycle. So if you take over a given team, you're not just stuck with the players that you inherited and you don't really know how to replace them, or you don't know which guys should you keep, which guys fit your scheme, which guys should you consider trading and finding a guy that's maybe just as good but fits your scheme a little bit better. I think that this is something that maybe a few guys in the league can benefit from. If you're anything like me, you don't need to be giving the top users in our league another advantage. You at least want to be on even footing when it comes to talent and personnel, and that goes a lot deeper than just your OVR ratings. I think just about everybody in the league kind of understands that, but some people understand that on more of an abstract level, and I would like to get more specific. So let's say you decide, okay, the 3-4 sounds like a good fit for my personnel. And that's key though, is don't just pick 3-4 because it sounds nice, because you might be starting with 11 guys that really should be running a 4-3. But let's say that you have settled on 3-4 and you decide either you've picked a team that runs a 3-4 and they're pretty well suited in terms of personnel, or they have enough pieces there that you can switch to a 3-4. I mentioned that you have the nose tackle in the middle. They should be huge. Yeah, you're talking 330 pounds or more type of size. In past Maddens, I have paid attention to size. I've read varying accounts of whether size really mattered. That's kind of moot now because it's been stated pretty explicitly that size and strength and weight will matter now more. So you really want that nose tackle to be a huge defensive tackle. I'm looking for 90 plus strength. You really don't need to pay attention to speed and acceleration. If you draft a guy that happens to be freakish, with like high 70s or even like mid 70s speed, great, but like that's fine. Their job is to absorb blockers. Their job is to guard the run to either side, and that, like we talked about, that 2-gap play. He's a guy that there's nothing wrong with having a guy that's a specialist. He's playing first and second down. Consider rotating him off the field on third down. Maybe rotate one of your defensive ends onto the inside. He's a little bit better of a pass rusher, and then put a pass rushing specialist on the outside on those third, medium, third and long, obvious passing situations. Maybe if you have an elite nose tackle, maybe he stays all 3 downs. Vince Wilfork in his prime was a 3-down nose tackle, but they're very rare. You should not feel like you need to have your nose tackle play 3 downs. Besides strength, I would say the number one stat you need to be looking for is block shed. Get him up to 99. Like if you have a 99 block shed guy with a lower OVR, you're doing pretty well. Because his responsibility is not going to be to rush the passer, it's nice if you have the power moves, but don't worry about it. Like he doesn't need to be a 90 plus power moves guy. If you have an elite player, that's great. He might be that, but the elite nose tackles are 330 plus pounds, 90 plus strength, and as close to 99 block shed as you can possibly get him. Now let's move on to defensive ends. I mentioned that they're a little bit bigger than what you might find in a 4-3. You're looking at the 285 to 305 pound range. They're stronger. They're similar to the nose tackle in the sense that they're typically responsible for 2 gaps, but obviously you do have 1-gap guys out there. The number one guy that comes to mind is J.J. Watt. He's a guy that's going to be rushing the passer, playing aggressive, playing upfield. But in general, your guy's primary role is to stop the run. I would say one of your 2 defensive ends, at the very least, should be a run-stopping specialist if you can't find 2 elite players. Acceleration, agility probably matters a little bit. It does matter a little bit more than a nose tackle, but again, you don't need those 85 speed, pass rushing, 90 acceleration freaks in a 3-4. Get big, strong guys. You can take your best pass rushing DE and move them on the inside to replace the nose tackle, like I was talking about on third down. Put a pass rushing specialist on the outside. There's nothing wrong with that. So you don't need 80 plus speed here on the defensive end. You want to be a little bit faster than nose tackle, but high 70s is I think J.J. Watt was like 77 or 79 speed in Madden 16, and I think he still had like a 20 sack season. So you want a little bit better acceleration, but you don't need crazy fast guys. If you do want to run kind of a 1-gap system where you have everybody in the front sevens responsible for a single gap, it allows you to play a little bit more aggressive. It can be weaker against the run. But then maybe you can get DEs that are a little bit more athletic and leaner, like the 270 pound range, I think is around where J.J. Watt is. You want them a little bit faster, high 70s, if not 80 speed, maybe acceleration in the mid 80s or low 80s even. But you don't necessarily need all those things if you're going to just put run stuffers along the line. It's also a good idea when you're drafting, don't ignore the 4-3 defensive tackles, because 4-3 defensive tackles oftentimes make for awesome 3-4 defensive ends. There's nothing cheesy about that. The NFL does it all the time where they're drafting guys who played one position in college, and it just so happens it's not the same scheme as the team that drafted them, so they switch their position nominally, but they really ask them to do a lot of similar things. So what a 4-3 defensive tackle is expected to do can translate to what a 3-4 defensive end is asked to do. Outside linebackers, like I said, they're your primary pass rushers. I think your goal should be at least one of these 2 guys needs to be a premier pass rusher. You want an elite pass rushing specialist. They often call them the jack linebacker. Their primary job is to rush the passer on almost every single down. You might occasionally throw some trickery in where they drop into like a flat or a short zone, but for the most part, they're rushing the passer. Any confusion involved with that really has to do more with moving around the field than anything else. But there's not really a lot of mystery. You know, your Von Millers, your Jadeveon Clowneys, they're coming after the quarterback almost every play. You want them to be a little bit on the larger side in that 245 to 260 pound range. You can even be able to rotate them into the defensive line on passing situations. You know, I mentioned earlier you can rotate the defensive end inside, bring the nose tackle off the field, and put a specialist on the line. Well, this can be your specialist. It doesn't have to be a backup. So like I said, your Von Millers, your DeMarcus Wares, these are the prototypical outside linebacker pass rushers. You generally want to avoid the smaller linebackers in that 230 to 240 pound range. It's not that it can't work. I'm sure you could look around the NFL and find a couple of exceptions, but in general, those guys are better suited for the 4-3 because they're going to have a little bit more trouble setting the edge against the run. Keep in mind, there's only 3 down linemen, which means these outside linebackers, even though they're pass rushing specialists, have to also set the edge against the run. Whereas in a 4-3, the outside linebackers have a little bit more freedom to roam around and just make the tackle while their defensive linemen are absorbing blocks. So you really want your guy to be in the 92 to 99 range in terms of either power or finesse move. These guys are where you want your 80 to 85 speed, high acceleration. We're talking 87 plus acceleration. These are where you want your athletes to be. In any given scheme, conceptually speaking, you have to figure out where are you investing your premium resources. What I mean by that is your first round draft picks. Where are you investing? Where are you spending a lot of money in free agency, or where are you giving up a good player to get an equally good player at a more important position? Well, outside linebacker, at least getting one of these guys into a premier pass rusher, it should be where some of your premium resources are invested if you're not starting off with one. I like to have one of my starting linebackers who's, if I can't get 2 elite pass rushers, I like one of them to be a little bit more balanced, maybe more in like the 80 plus power moves type of thing, making them a little bit better against the run. Able to drop back into flat zones a little bit. I don't like to blitz 5 every single down. So if you don't have 2 elite pass rushers, that's fine. You want them both to be 80 plus though in something. And the other one can be a little bit more balanced. Like I said, you can drop him into various zones a little bit better, move him around the field. But I honestly do prefer personally having one of my outside linebackers be a premium pass rusher who I'm rarely going to put in coverage. I don't often even spend a lot of points, if any, boosting his zone coverage. I'm fine with it at 60. Moving on to inside linebackers, I mentioned they also need to be bigger. I prefer 245 plus pounds because, again, they need to be capable of taking on offensive linemen, shedding blocks, and making the tackle, whereas a 4-3 linebacker is kind of flying around the field, sideline to sideline. So with the inside linebackers, there's 4 linebackers on the field. They don't need the speed. They don't have to go sideline to sideline. Yeah, speed's good. Speed's always better. If you can get the same player plus an extra few speed points, that's great. But this is not a position where you need to be investing in like getting a freakish athlete at inside linebacker. There's exceptions, but Patrick Willis played inside linebacker and he's a freakish athlete. But you don't need a Patrick Willis to be successful. Their primary attributes, you're really looking for high play recognition. They should be fundamentally sound tacklers. I look at these guys as primarily run stoppers. I do like my number 1 inside linebacker to be pretty competent at dropping into short zones, like 75 plus. And again, speed's not the big deal there. You're not dropping them into deep blues. You're not flying them out to the flats. The idea is that they just need to be competent and have half a brain when receivers are running into their zones, so they can at least be in the right place positionally. The second inside linebacker I usually will look at as a run stopping specialist, because on pass downs, the offense is probably trotting out three or four wide receivers anyway. So you're taking that guy off the field on 3rd and medium or 3rd and long. So I don't really care about his zone coverage at all. I mentioned kind of a wrinkle of zone blitzing. Most of what I've been talking about is a more traditional 3-4, where there's not as much confusion as the zone blitzing, where it aligns a little bit better with man coverage on the back end. But if you can pull it off, 3-4, like I said, matches up really well with zone blitzing schemes. The idea with zone blitzing, and there's lots of plays in Madden playbooks, so you can definitely run it. Pressure can come from anywhere on the field. It actually works pretty well if you don't have that like number one amazing premium pass rusher, because they're not easy to get. If they were easy to get, they wouldn't be such a premium. So if you don't have the one guy that is just an amazing pass rusher, you should think about running a zone blitzing scheme and taking advantage of confusion and subterfuge to make up for the fact that you don't have that premium guy. Everyone needs to be capable of rushing the passer in this zone blitzing system. We're looking at everyone should be 80 plus, maybe even 85. So you're looking for versatility. You also need more guys to be competent in coverage. I mentioned earlier that I like that second inside linebacker to be a run stopping specialist. Well, if I was running zone blitzing schemes, I'd want him to be pretty solid at dropping back in coverage. I would even invest a little bit in trying to boost up to at least vaguely competent levels the zone coverage ratings of my defensive ends. You're really not going to be dropping nose tackles into zone coverage, but you want the other 6 guys on your front 7, you want any one of them to be able to drop into a zone or rush the passer at any moment. It may or may not confuse the offensive line AI, but it will definitely confuse the human users. None of us are professional quarterbacks. We can make reads, but at the end of the day, once you start throwing people out of their comfort zone, they might know how to beat a cover 3 or a cover 2, but if you suddenly have something that looks like neither, and with people dropping into zones from angles that you just weren't expecting, that's how you generate turnovers. So I think this is a hard scheme to pull off, but if you don't have that premium pass rusher, it's worth thinking about. So moving on to the 4-3. Obviously, it's 4 down linemen and 3 linebackers. Going over the positions, you have 2 defensive tackles in the middle, who predominantly stop the run, but their job is also to get penetration and push upfield, push toward the quarterback is what that means. I mentioned 3-4, there could be 2 gap or 1 gap systems. 4-3 is pretty much a 1 gap system. When you run a 4-3, all 4 of your defensive linemen need to be able to get through their 1 gap and get up to the quarterback and or stop the rusher who's coming through that gap. So you're looking for defensive tackles they're more athletic than a nose tackle. They need to be a little bit faster, have a little bit better acceleration. A premier defensive tackle can really dominate a game. Your defensive ends are your pass rushing specialists. These guys are your 250, 260 pound guys that can really get around the edge. I would probably be favoring finesse move there, but power move can work. But they also need to be big enough and strong enough to contain the outside run. They call it setting the edge is what I referred to earlier. In the 3-4, generally speaking, your outside linebackers are doing that. But in the 4-3, sometimes that can be your defensive ends doing that. So they can't be complete 240-pound weaklings if you can avoid it. Because you have 4 down linemen, 4-3 tends to be a little bit better against the run on average. And it can be more effective at bringing pressure without needing extra blitzers. You are throwing those 2 pass rushing specialists at the quarterback just about every play. But a weakness is it does tend to be a little bit more predictable. You don't necessarily need to blitz as much in a 4-3, and you kind of know where the pressure is coming from a lot of the time. But since you do have that 1 gap responsibility across the board, it allows all your defensive linemen to penetrate aggressively as soon as the ball is snapped. So it's a very balanced front, which means it can really work with basically any coverage shell. We'll talk at a later point about these shells, but I would say that 4-3 works extremely well with like a cover 2 or a cover 3. One variation of a cover 2, they call it the Tampa 2. I mentioned it doesn't really work as well in a 3-4. The reason is because that requires very specific personnel. It's a scheme that was popularized by the Buccaneers, the Bears, among others, guys like Tony Dungy, Monty Kiffin, Lovie Smith. It's very simple in concept, but the Tampa 2, you want smaller, faster guys who play really smart You don't need those big, giant, strong players. You want speed, you want elite athleticism, and you want surefire tackling. So I'll talk about it in greater detail when we go over coverages, but since this does affect the front seven, I'll go over a little bit who you might want to be looking for, because you need freakish athletes at the linebacker spots and a dominant pass rusher in at least one of your defensive end spots. With the Tampa 2, you're basically never blitzing. For all practical purposes, you are never blitzing. And as a result, you have to get consistent pressure with your front four. So you need that dominant pass rusher. In addition, your linebackers are covering a lot of field. They are dropping in zone coverages often. So they need to be fast and they need to be smart in coverage. Even more specifically in the Tampa 2, and I know this was revamped in Madden 17, so I think the Tampa 2 is going to be even better. So running that cover 2 with the right personnel is going to be even better in Madden 17. You have a middle linebacker whose job is to carry the tight end deep over the seams. Everyone kind of knows from Madden 15, how do you beat cover 2? Okay, tight end up the seams. Well, that is exactly what Tampa 2 was designed to stop, is that people were beating cover 2, and so they added some extra wrinkles with Tampa 2, and one of it is that middle linebacker needs to be fast enough to get deep. That's your Brian Urlacher was like your prototype Tampa 2 middle linebacker. He needs to be fast, he needs to be a freakish athlete, but he also needs to be strong enough and smart enough to recognize the run and then plug the gap up the middle if it is in fact a run. The last note about the Tampa 2 that I'll throw out there is you can't just run it with any old personnel and say, oh, Madden, it doesn't work in Madden. Just like the NFL, you need very specific personnel to run the Tampa 2 well. But if you can get your hands on it, I think it can be very effective. And we'll talk about that more in greater detail. I know that Raider ran Tampa 2 in Madden 16 and he ended up winning a Super Bowl with it. So anyone who says that cover 2 doesn't work, it can definitely work. You just need to understand why it works and then get the right personnel to make it work. So in going back to 4-3 in general, not Tampa 2, but 4-3 in general, your DTs should be strong and very athletic for their size. These are freakish athletes for their size. You know, Ndamukong Suh is probably your archetype for a dominant 4-3 defensive tackle. You want much higher speed and acceleration than a 3-4 nose tackle. I would say power moves is huge. Block shedding is also big. Honestly, you need, like I said, you need this guy to be a very good player. Your top DT should be a very good player. But power move is more valuable because, again, they're penetrating. They're getting towards the quarterback. Block shedding is great, but I would say power moves is more important in a 4-3. I mentioned DEs are your pass rusher. You're looking for guys that are around 260 pounds. It's not that they can't be smaller. It's just, again, their responsibility is to hold the edge. And so when you start to get down to those 240-pound guys, they can just sometimes get crushed by larger or stronger offensive linemen against the run. So a lot of times you'll see those 240-pound defensive ends might be your pass rushing specialists that you bring in on third down, but they may not be as good as at being like a 3-down defensive end. Dwight Freeney is a great example of like an ideal 4-3 defensive end. I mean, he could be a defensive end in any 4-3 system. Tampa 2 as well. The outside linebackers, they don't need to be great pass rushers. I mentioned Tampa 2, you virtually never blitz. And a vanilla 4-3 with, different coverage schemes behind it, you can definitely blitz. So it's not that these guys need to be incompetent at pass rushing, but you really don't need them to be 90 plus in power move or finesse move. There's no reason to waste your premium, draft picks or trading for guys that have amazing pass rushing moves and then run a 4-3 where they never rush the passer. That's just a waste. 80 plus is nice because that way you can throw in a blitz every now and then and keep the offense honest. Just they'd have to always be worried that this guy could come at the quarterback. But in general, they need to be capable of dropping into coverage regularly while also having the play recognition and tackle ratings to fly to the ball. Your 4-3 linebackers, both the two outside linebackers and the middle linebacker, is who you're thinking of when you hear the phrase fly sideline to sideline, fly to the ball. It's not that can't happen in other positions, but that's like the prototype is they're flying all around the field, they're dropping back in coverage, and then they're beelining to the ball when it's a run. The middle linebacker is a premium position in the 4-3. I said in the 3-4 you don't necessarily need to find those freakish athletes, but in the 4-3 it really will help you. Speed matters for a 4-3 middle linebacker. Again, like I said, he needs to go sideline to sideline. He's got 4 linemen in front of him absorbing blocks. He's got an outside linebacker who might very well absorb another block. So someone's got to be there to make the tackle, which means wherever the run goes, the middle linebacker needs to be able to get there. He can be on the smaller side. He can be that 225 to 240 pound guy instead of the 250 pound inside linebacker in a 3-4. Because ideally, he should not be taking on blockers nearly as often. As I stated above, in a Tampa 2, in particular, the middle linebacker needs to be even faster and excellent in coverage over the middle. I'm going to kind of end this with just a note on the hybrid scheme. In Madden, the hybrid scheme is really pretty simplistic. It really just involves mixing up your 3-4 and your 4-3 looks. So, I guess you can, since we're doing custom playbooks on defense, maybe you can throw in some versatile players who can, move from the line to the linebacker position. The reality is, in real life, a hybrid scheme is a lot more complex. It has to do with schemes where you might have 2 or 3 guys in 1 gap responsibility and 1 or 2 guys in 2 gap responsibility to kind of maximize the skill set of whoever's on the field. Madden, as far as I've seen, certainly through Madden 16, does not represent that well. It's just now you're talking about the incredible variation that you see in the NFL. So we can revisit this, but I don't think we're going to see this much in Madden 17. So really, there is no hybrid scheme in Madden 17. It's just there are playbooks where you can get some 3-4 and 4-3 looks, but that's not really a hybrid scheme. It's just the level of complexity in mixed gap responsibility is something that Madden really doesn't attempt to simulate yet. So if it does in the future, we'll revisit it. So that's the front 7, guys. If anyone has any questions, feel free to send me a message in Discord. If you have any questions about your team, you want some advice, I've kind of said leading up to this that I'm laying it all on the table. In Madden 17, I'm going to say everything I know, and if you know more than me, awesome. And if you don't, hopefully by the end of this series, you will know just as much as I know. We'll be covering, no pun intended, coverages over the next 2 or 3 podcasts. Like I said, my goal is to help you not just understand what the coverage is, but help you understand which coverages you should be picking for your personnel, and then how to pick personnel moving forward in drafts and trades and free agency that can help you execute that even better. So I hope this has been useful and at least somewhat informative. Like I said, I know this is going to be one of the more basic ones. A lot of you know a lot about 3-4 versus 4-3 already. But hopefully there's a couple of you out there that learned a few things. There's certainly no shame if you don't know anything that I covered or everything that I covered. Like I said, I've learned a ton over the last few years. So this is RFF from the Commissioner's Office signing off. See you guys in a couple weeks.